So this video is about OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, which is something that is often talked about, certainly in recent years, and people will use it in various ways as, I have a bit of OCD, for example. But a lot of the people that I work with will describe themselves as having some kind of obsessive thought that compels them to some kind of behavior. So although people might talk about it as in, I have OCD, like I have a cold, it's more accurate to say, I do OCD, I do something compulsive as a result of obsessing over. So I don't want to get too into that, because I wanted to give you an example today that maybe just gives you a slightly different perspective on this thing we call OCD, which in essence is a compulsion to do something in order to feel less scared. Yeah, so most often it's driven by an underlying fear. And an example I'm going to give you is from ancient times, although OCD is a reasonably recent term. The compulsion to carry out an act based on an underlying fear or belief is there to see in the ancient world. And I'm going to use the example of the Aztecs and their compulsion to sacrifice their own kind, to sacrifice perfectly healthy humans out of the fear that they had gods to appease, and that perhaps if they didn't do this, then bad things would happen to them and their people. And they obviously deeply believed this, because one can only imagine the suffering that must have caused to take healthy people out of their society in order for them to undergo this most brutal of fates. Just gives you some indication of just how scared they were. So, driven by the fear that if they didn't do the sacrifice, something bad would happen, be that the sun wouldn't rise again, or that they would be plagued with something, or something at the hands of the gods that they envisaged there being. Actually, we start to understand some of the dynamics with these obsessive behaviors, and one of those being, the more people that believe in something, the more believable it becomes, right? So if we have the whole of our culture, our society, acting in a way that suggests this belief driven from fear is in any ways true, then our tendency to operate as if it were true, whether or not it is that much more increased. Yeah. So the more people believe something, the more believable it becomes. Secondly, the fear that underlies. When we are in a state of fear, our brain functions in a different way. Our upper brain, the neocortex as it's known, effectively reduces in its operation, or goes offline, as we might say, and we move through the levels of the brain into the limbic system, into that part that's more concerned with emotions and social connection, and then even deeper than that into the part that governs our very survival, which is the brain stem, and in that lower part of the brain. So when we are in a state of fear, our ability to take an idea and inspect it and analyze it and critique it is much reduced, if not there at all. So if we're scared and somebody suggests that unless we do this thing, however horrific it might be, then bad things will happen, then again our tendency to believe it, coupled with the fact that it's being believed by lots of other people who we can see within our social grouping, again increases. So driven out of fear, driven out of the fact that other people are believing it, we start to behave in a way that it is true. And here's the third factor in this. Every time that we do that thing, every time the Aztecs were to make this sacrifice, and the thing that they had believed would happen if they didn't, doesn't happen, i.e. the sun does come up in the morning, it confirms the pattern that they have suggested to themselves, that if we weren't to do this, it would happen, but because we've done it, it didn't happen. We've averted whatever threat they suspected there as being. So there we really start to give weight to this idea, and around it goes, and it starts to build momentum, it starts to build more believability. The more we do it, the more the thing we fear doesn't happen, the more true it becomes, right? So we end up with this belief. And again, looping back into OCD, we can see this very much. We do the thing in order to gain some alleviation of the fear. The thing we fear doesn't happen because most times it was never going to happen, but we start to convince ourselves that there's a need to do it. And often the need to do it more and more and more as a means of dealing with the increased underlying state of fear. So I hope that gives you somewhat of a different perspective on this thing we call OCD, Although it's a new term, it's there for us to see in ancient times, and the mechanics of us as a species are very much the same as they would have been way back then. And this is what makes it useful for us to be able to look at examples from throughout history and say, actually, what's really going on here, and therefore how best to treat it and to overcome it. Thanks for watching.